Welcome back, AP Bio, to our Chapter 8.2 discussion on photosynthesis. As a reminder, photosynthesis is a two-part process. The light-dependent reactions, which, like the name implies, utilize light, and the Calvin cycle, also known as the dark reactions, although they do not only take place at night. Both of these are going to be taking place inside the chloroplast, an organelle inside plants, which, as we remember, used to have ancestry as an independent bacteria, but then was swallowed by another organism through endocytosis. Although they're going to take place in different parts of the chloroplast. The chloroplast almost has its own individual organelle with these thylakoid structures, where our light reactions are going to take place. So within the thylakoid, there are structures that contain pigments, the most famous of which, chlorophyll, I'm sure we've all heard of, that absorb light. So these pigments are absorbing light to carry out some reactions. These light reactions are going to utilize water coming in, and they will end up releasing oxygen. I'll move myself over here. So you can see they're releasing oxygen. They're also going to oxidize ADP into ATP, and they're going to reduce an electron carrier NADP to NADPH. Don't worry about memorizing all the numbers, but you should be aware of kind of what's coming in and what's coming out. So this is the overall light reaction taking place in our thylakoid. We have our thylakoid membrane with a lot of embedded proteins, proteins like photosystems, like cytochromes. We have NADP reductase, which, just like it sounds, is going to reduce NADP into NADPH. And we have our old friend ATP synthase. Now, you might notice that this is looking very similar to cellular respiration, where we have an electron transport chain. We're moving hydrogen ions into a space that will then go through ATP synthase to produce ATP. So it's very similar to oxidative phosphorylation with that chemiosmotic and electron transport chain aspects, with some slight differences. So light has photons, which are waves that carry energy. And these energy waves have the ability to excite electrons and get them to a higher energy state. So as light hits these electrons in water, they're going to get excited, and then we're going to utilize that energy in these high energy electrons to carry out that electron transport chain. So chlorophyll molecules are great at absorbing light, and they're going to allow for the electrons from water to get to an excited state. Those electrons are going to be releasing heat as well as photons of their own, something called fluorescence, where we can see, if we were to distill that, a glow released by these electrons in chlorophyll. And these chlorophyll molecules are located inside structures called photosystems, which are going to absorb that light energy, transfer that energy, and excite those electrons. So this entire process is going to happen where our water molecule is actually going to get split into oxygen that the plants will release, and hydrogen ions that'll get utilized, and some electrons. So those electrons in our photosystem 2, or the P680, are going to get excited. Those are now going to flow through those cytochrome proteins embedded in the thylakoid membrane. That reaction, as it loses that energy is going to be released through a series of reactions to move hydrogen ions across the membrane and use ATP synthase to make ATP. Those electrons are then going to arrive at photosystem 1, or P700, where more light is going to hit more pigment molecules, mostly chlorophyll and green leaf plants, excite those electrons again, and then those electrons are going to move through the electron transport chain to NADP reductase, which is a protein that's going to help catalyze the reaction of NADP to NADPH. And those electron carriers will carry those electrons over to the Calvin cycle. So Water is really important in this process, and water molecules are going to be split apart in photosystem 2. And those hydrogen ions are going to be utilized in the electron transport chain, moving them across. Oxygen is going to get released, and those electrons are going to be utilized to power our electron transport chain. One little fun bit, you may notice that we have photosystem 2 before we have photosystem 1. That's because photosystem 1 was discovered first, and then they discovered photosystem 2 and named it 1 and 2 based on when they named them. It wasn't until later that they realized that photosystem 2 was the first photosystem in the process, but by that point they'd already been named and they just kept them. As a reminder, the electron transport chain, the flow of electrons is going to generate the power to move protons across a thylakoid membrane, just like we saw in cellular respiration. So this thylakoid membrane is going to be very similar to this inner mitochondria membrane, where that electron transport chain is moving hydrogen ions across that membrane. When inside of chloroplasts, it's moving across the thylakoid space inside the thylakoid. Then those are going to fall out of ATP synthase and generate ATP. Exact same process. You don't have to learn anything new. Just know it's now in a chloroplast instead of a mitochondria. ATP synthase, remember that's that rotor protein. So as hydrogen ions are falling through ATP synthase, this is actually going to rotate and catalyze that reaction of ADP into ATP. Really cool engineering made entirely out of amino acids. Pretty cool. So let's look back at that big picture, and we can see photosystem 2 absorbing light and splitting apart water to harvest those electrons that are going to get excited at those pigment molecules. We can see oxygen getting released, and that's going to leave the leaf through those stomata. Hydrogen ions are getting produced, which are going to get pumped through ATP synthase. The electron transport chain through these cytochrome proteins is going to catalyze the movement of even more hydrogen ions into this thylakoid space from the stroma. And now we're going to have a really high concentration of these, and those will continue to fall through ATP synthase, spinning that protein and generating ATP that we'll get to utilize in the Calvin cycle. Those electrons at the end of that first bit of the electron transport chain get excited in photosystem 1 now. Again, light is hitting those pigment molecules, exciting those electrons to a higher energy state. And then those will get grabbed by NADP plus to make NADPH, and those electrons will get taken to the Calvin cycle. All right, that's what we have for today. See you next time.